Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery. Smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The orchids were behaving themselves that Tuesday morning, which was more than I could say for the woman sitting across from me in the front room. Her name was Constance Bradall, and she had the kind of face that photographers love and lawyers distrust. All fine bones and careful composure, with eyes that were doing a great deal more calculating than her soft voice suggested. She was 42, I guessed, though she'd have argued the point. Her suit was charcoal wool, her pearls were real, and she'd arrived at the brownstone on West 35th Street at precisely 10:15, which told me she'd either taken a cab or lived close enough to walk without breaking a sweat. I'd let her in myself, since Fritz was occupied with something that smelled strongly of tarragon, and shown her to the front room to wait while I went upstairs to interrupt Nero Wolfe's morning communion with his orchids. This is a ritual I perform with the same enthusiasm a man might feel when interrupting a grizzly bear's nap, but Wolfe had instructed me the night before that if a Constance Bradall appeared, I was to bring her up immediately. He hadn't told me why. He rarely does. The plant rooms occupy the entire top floor of the brownstone, 10,000 orchids in 4 climate-controlled rooms, tended by Theodore Horstman with a devotion that borders on the theological. Wolfe spends 2 hours there every morning, 9 to 11, and 2 more every afternoon, 4 to 6. During these periods, the President of the United States could arrive with a marching band and a signed confession to the Lincoln assassination, and Wolfe would finish deadheading his Lelio before seeing him. I found him in the cool room, standing before a row of odontoglossum, with his hands clasped behind his back, which on a man of his dimensions, roughly 1/7 of a ton, distributed over 6 feet 1 inch, gives the impression of a very intelligent boulder contemplating the landscape. "Mrs. Bradall is downstairs," I said. "Is she composed?" "Externally. Her hands are giving her some trouble." His face, wide and dark-complexioned, gave nothing away, which was its usual condition. "We'll see her in the office." "You want me to bring her up? It's only 10:18. "I am aware of the time, Archie." He moved toward the door with the ponderous deliberation that passes for urgency in his world. Some situations do not improve with waiting. This was, by Wolfe's standards, practically a sprint. The office is the best room in the house, which is saying something, because Fritz Brenner keeps the whole brownstone in a condition that would shame most 5-star hotels. 2 walls of books, Wolfe's desk positioned so that he faces the room and the door simultaneously, my desk at a right angle to his, the big globe in the corner, and the red leather chair positioned in front of Wolfe's desk, for clients and suspects alike. I've always thought the red chair was a calculated choice. It's comfortable enough to relax people, but the color keeps them slightly unsettled without knowing why. Mrs. Bradall settled into it with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to sitting in important offices, and waited while Wolfe arranged himself behind his desk and pressed the button that would bring Fritz with beer. She didn't look around the room the way most clients do. She looked at Wolfe. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "thank you for seeing me. You were recommended by Mr. Parker. Nathaniel Parker is my attorney, and occasionally Wolfe's, a reliable man with a reliable reputation. If he'd sent this woman, there was something worth hearing. He tells me your brother has died." "Was murdered," she said without flinching. "The distinction matters to me, and to the law, if we can establish it. Tell me about your brother." She opened her handbag, took out a photograph, and placed it on the edge of Wolfe's desk. He didn't look at it immediately, which is one of his more unsettling habits. He looked at her. "His name was Gerald Bradall," she said. "He was 47 years old. 3 weeks ago, he fell from the terrace of his apartment on the 14th floor of the Caldwell Arms on East 68th Street. The police ruled it an accident." "And you disagree?" "Gerald was terrified of heights. He hadn't been on that terrace in the 4 years he'd lived in the apartment. He told me once that he couldn't even look at the glass doors without feeling sick." She paused. "He was also about to change his will. Fritz arrived with the beer. Wolfe poured, watched the foam settle with the patience of a man who has arranged his entire life around the avoidance of haste, and drank. Then, and only then, he picked up the photograph. Gerald Breadhall looked out at us from what appeared to be a restaurant. A man with his sister's fine bones, but none of her composure, grinning at the camera with the slightly desperate cheerfulness of someone who laughs loudest at his own jokes. Handsome, soft around the jaw, with the beginning of the kind of weight that comes from good restaurants and mild unhappiness. What was the nature of the intended change? Wolfe asked. Gerald was the primary beneficiary of our mother's estate, approximately $4 million in securities and property held in trust. Under the current terms of the trust, upon Gerald's death without issue, the entire estate passes to the 3 other beneficiaries equally. She folded her hands in her lap. Those beneficiaries are myself, our cousin Philip Osterbrook, and the Meridian Cultural Foundation. And the change Gerald intended? He was going to remove Philip entirely. Wolfe set the photograph down. Why? He didn't tell me specifically. He said he'd discovered something about Philip that changed everything. Those were his words, changed everything. He was going to speak with our attorney, Martin Geist, the following Monday. Gerald died on the Saturday before that Monday. I wrote down Philip Osterbrook and Martin Geist and Meridian Cultural Foundation in my notebook. Then added, convenient timing, with a small asterisk. You have spoken with the police, Wolfe said. At length, a detective named Rowcliffe. I know Rowcliffe, I said. This was not a compliment. Told me that the physical evidence supported an accident, that Gerald had been drinking that evening, and that no one had been seen entering or leaving the apartment building who couldn't be accounted for. She allowed herself the smallest of bitter smiles. He was very thorough in explaining why there was nothing to investigate. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, which, reinforced to his specifications, accepted his weight without complaint. He laced his fingers over his middle section, a gesture I've catalogued as indicating either deep thought or the approach of lunch, and at 10:30 it was the former. Who benefits most immediately from your brother's death, as matters currently stand? Philip. Gerald's share of the estate, approximately $1.3 million, is divided 3 ways. Philip's portion increases by nearly $450,000. And if Gerald had succeeded in removing him from the trust, Philip would have received nothing, 0. He knew it was coming. Gerald had told him, apparently, in a phone call the week before he died. Philip called me in quite a state about it. She paused. He said Gerald was being irrational and vindictive, and that he intended to contest any change. Which he now has no reason to do, I observed, since the original terms hold. Precisely, Mr. Goodwin. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Outside, a taxi horn made its opinion known about something, and the September light came through the windows at an angle that turned the dust motes into small gold planets. Breadhall, Wolfe said at last, I will be frank with you, because I find dishonesty with clients produces poor results all around. You have given me motive, opportunity, and a suspicious coincidence of timing. What you have not given me is a single piece of evidence that a crime occurred. The police, whatever their limitations, are not wrong to require more than a dead man's unexpressed fear of heights and a family dispute over inheritance. She reached into her bag again and placed a small envelope on his desk. This was in Gerald's apartment. His housekeeper, Mrs. Varela, found it behind the drawer of his bedside table, when she was cleaning 3 days after his death. She brought it to me because it has my name on it. Wolfe opened the envelope without ceremony. I watched his face, which is generally like watching the front of a bank vault for signs of emotion, but something moved across it. Brief, controlled, filed away. He passed the envelope to me. Inside was a single index card in a man's handwriting, the letter slightly rushed, as though written quickly or under pressure. It read, Connie, if something happens, look at the foundation. It isn't what anyone thinks. Ask who really runs it. G. I put the card down and looked at Wolfe. He was looking at Mrs. Breadhall. When did your brother write this? I don't know. The envelope wasn't sealed, just folded shut. And you've shown this to no one else? Only to Mr. Parker, who showed me the door in your direction. Wolfe was quiet for 10 seconds. I counted them, because with Wolfe, silence is a language, and the pauses have grammar. Very well, he said. My fee is $150 a day, plus expenses, with a $5,000 retainer. I accept your case, Mrs. Bradall, with the understanding that you will answer every question I put to you, volunteer any information that becomes relevant, regardless of its personal sensitivity, and allow me to conduct this investigation as I see fit, without interference or impatience. She didn't blink. Agreed. Good. Now, he refilled his glass. Tell me everything about the Meridian Cultural Foundation, and leave nothing out because you think it unimportant. I will decide what is important. She began talking, and I began writing, and the September light moved across the floor of the office, and somewhere in the building, Fritz was doing something that now smelled of shallots and wine, and another case had found its way through the brownstone's front door, and settled in for what I suspected, from the look on that index card, was going to be a complicated stay. The Meridian Cultural Foundation, as Mrs. Bradall explained it, was a private charitable organization established 12 years ago to support emerging composers and musical performance programs in the city. Gerald Bradall had been one of its founding donors, contributing substantially to its initial endowment, and had joined its board of directors 4 years later. The foundation was currently run, administratively on a day-to-day basis, by its executive director, a man named Warren Hood, whom Mrs. Bradall described with carefully chosen words as very capable and very charming. The foundation's board consisted of 5 members: Gerald Bradall, now deceased, a retired banker named Raymond Thorpe, a woman named Sylvia Donat, who ran a gallery in the 50s, Warren Hood himself, and a man named Felix Caro, who, as Mrs. Bradall noted with a tightening around her eyes, was Philip Osterbrook's closest friend, and had been for 20 years. I underlined Felix Caro twice. Is there any financial irregularity you're aware of at the foundation? Wolfe asked. Not that I can document. Gerald mentioned once, perhaps 2 months ago, that he was puzzled by some of the foundation's expenditure reports. He said the numbers were technically correct, but didn't quite add up to the programs they were supposed to represent. He was going to look into it more carefully. She paused. A week later he called me and said it was nothing, not to worry. Had he been contacted by anyone between those 2 calls? She thought about it. Yes. He mentioned speaking with Warren Hood. He said Warren had explained everything satisfactorily. But he was still going to remove Philip from the trust, I said. Yes. Whatever Warren explained about the foundation, it apparently didn't resolve what he discovered about Philip. Wolfe nodded. One final question for now, Mrs. Bradall. Your brother's apartment. Who had access to it? Gerald, obviously. His housekeeper, Mrs. Varela, who has a key. The building has a doorman around the clock. She hesitated. And Philip has a key. Gerald gave it to him years ago when Philip went through a difficult period and was staying with him occasionally. He never asked for it back. I wrote down Philip has a key, and this time didn't bother with an asterisk. Some things are their own punctuation. Wolfe dismissed her at 11:40, keeping the index card and the photograph, and sat in silence for a full 2 minutes after I'd shown her out. I sat at my desk and reviewed my notes, and waited. I've learned over the years that interrupting Wolfe's silences is about as productive as arguing with weather. Archie, he said at last. Right here. This afternoon I want you to visit the Caldwell Arms and speak with the doorman and superintendent. I want to know who visited Gerald Bradall in the 2 weeks before his death, and specifically in the 48 hours before it. I also want you to locate Mrs. Bradall, Varela, and speak with her about her employer's recent behavior and state of mind. And Philip Osterbrook? Tomorrow. I want to speak with him here. He picked up his book. Also arrange for Warren Hood and Felix Caro to come in, separately, and without informing each of the other's appointment. That'll make me popular. You'll survive the disappointment. He opened the book. And Archie, be observant at the Caldwell Arms. The police have already looked and found nothing. That means we should look at what they chose not to see. It was, for Nero Wolfe, practically a standing ovation for my investigative talents. I took it in the spirit intended, and went to get my hat. The Caldwell Arms is the kind of building that was expensive 40 years ago, and has since become the kind of expensive that doesn't need to advertise. No uniformed doorman in a peaked hat. Instead, a discreet awning, a polished brass intercom, and a man named Eddie Sosa in a dark blazer who looked me over with the practiced neutrality of someone whose job is to keep the interesting people out. I handed him one of my cards, Archie Goodwin, Confidential Investigations, and told him I was looking into Gerald Bredahl's death on behalf of the family. This is technically true, in the way that most useful things are technically true. It contains the right facts, arranged to encourage the right conclusions. Eddie Sosa looked at the card, looked at me, and made the calculation that most people make about me, which is that I'm the kind of man who will stand in a lobby, asking questions until one of us is no longer vertical. What do you want to know? He said. What I wanted to know, and what I got over the next 40 minutes, was the following. Gerald Bredahl had been a considerate tenant of 4 years' standing, who tipped at Christmas and remembered Eddie's wife's name. In the week before his death, he'd had 4 visitors, his cousin Philip Osterbrook, who came twice, and on the second occasion left looking like he'd lost an argument. A well-dressed man in his mid-50s whom Eddie identified from my description as possibly matching Warren Hood. A woman Eddie didn't recognize, dark-haired, 30s, who stayed less than 20 minutes, and his attorney Martin Geist, who came on the Thursday, 3 days before Gerald died. On the night of the death, a Saturday, Eddie had not been on duty. The nightman was a person named Carl Reeves, who had since taken a position at a building in Murray Hill. I wrote down the address Eddie gave me and filed it for later. The superintendent was a round Slovenian named Anton Beff, who showed me Gerald's apartment with the air of a man performing a civic duty he finds distasteful. The apartment was still sealed. The family hadn't yet made arrangements, and it had the particular silence of rooms that know they've been the site of something final. I stood on the terrace. It is, as terraces go, unremarkable. 6 feet deep, 12 feet wide, a low wrought iron railing at waist height. A table and 2 chairs that hadn't been moved in some time, based on the faint rust circles they'd left on the concrete. Below, East 68th Street conducted its business with complete indifference. The railing was waist height. On a man of Gerald Bredahl's dimensions, 5'10", according to his driver's license, which his sister had shown me, it would have been at the hip. Low enough that a stumble, in darkness, with alcohol in the blood, could account for a fall. Low enough also that a push from behind, quickly applied, would have sent him over before he'd registered what was happening. I looked at the terrace floor. Clean, no obvious marks. I looked at the railing. I crouched down and looked at the 2 anchor points where the railing met the terrace wall. The left anchor had 3 scratches in the paint that hadn't been there long. Fresh metal showed through, bright and unoxidized. The scratches ran diagonally, as though something had scraped against the anchor while the railing moved, or while someone gripped it. I mentioned this to Anton Bev, who looked at it and shrugged, and said railings got scratched all the time. By what? I asked. He shrugged again. It is a very flexible shrug. I noted the scratches in my notebook and moved on. Mrs. Varela turned out to be a brisk woman of 60 who lived in Astoria and treated my visit with the suspicion it probably deserved. But she had liked Gerald Bredahl, which is the universal solvent for suspicion, and inside of 10 minutes she was telling me about the last 2 weeks of his life, with the detailed authority of someone who notices what passes through a household. He was worried, she said flatly. Not scared, not nervous, worried. like a man doing arithmetic in his head that won't come out right. About anything specific? He was on the phone a lot, more than usual, and he had his papers out, his financial papers, the folders from his filing cabinet, spread on the dining table when he would normally never do that. He was very neat. She paused. And he was writing things down, lists like, he'd write something and then cross it out. Did you see what was on the lists? Once I saw a column of numbers and some names. I didn't read it. That's not my place, but I saw it. She folded her hands. He threw them away before I came next. I found the pieces in the kitchen trash. I didn't put them back together. I made a note to ask if the trash had been collected and accepted that particular door as probably closed. The night he died, I said, did he seem different in the days before? She thought about it carefully, which I respected. People who think before they answer are telling you something honest, even when the answer is uncertain. Yes and no. Monday and Tuesday, he seemed lighter, like maybe whatever was worrying him had sorted itself out. He even made a joke when I left Tuesday. He never makes jokes, Mr. Goodwin. He's a serious man. She corrected herself quietly. He was. And Wednesday? Thursday? Thursday I was there. He was back to worried. Worse, maybe. He took a call while I was in the kitchen, and I heard him say, not loud, but I heard, "That isn't good enough, and you know it." And then he went quiet, for a long time after. Did you tell the police this? The detective didn't ask about phone calls. He asked about the terrace and whether Mr. Bradall drank. She said this without particular bitterness, but the implication was clear enough. I thanked her and left her my card, and took the subway back to Manhattan, thinking about a man who made a joke on Tuesday and was dead on Saturday, and about scratches on a railing that Anton Beff's shrug hadn't explained. Philip Osterbrook arrived at the brownstone the following morning at 11 sharp, which was the earliest I could schedule anyone, given Wolfe's orchid commitments, and presented himself as a man who was trying very hard to project unconcern, and was only partially succeeding. He was 50, trim, with silver hair that had been arranged with professional help, and the kind of tan that comes from either a Caribbean subscription or a good salon. His handshake was firm, in the way handshakes are when someone has been taught they should be firm. He took the red chair with the ease of a man who sits in important chairs regularly and has opinions about their quality. I appreciate Mr. Wolfe seeing me, he said. Mr. Wolfe sees everyone, I said pleasantly. Eventually. Wolfe came in at 2 minutes past 11. His standard 90-second statement about who determines the pace of things around here settled into his chair and regarded Osterbrook with the politely distant attention he gives to things he finds moderately interesting. Mr. Osterbrook, thank you for coming. Of course, though I'll say honestly, I'm not sure what use I'll be. Gerald's death was an accident, and I imagine Constance hired you because she's grieving and needs somewhere to put it. I understand that. Do you? Wolfe's voice carried no particular inflection, which in his case is a weapon. When did you last speak with your cousin? On the phone, the week before he died. We had a disagreement. About the trust. Osterbrook paused for a fraction of a second. Constance told you. Mrs. Bradall told me many things. What specifically did your cousin say? He said he was considering changes to the trust that would affect my position as a beneficiary. I told him I thought that was a mistake, and that I'd challenge any such change legally. He spread his hands in a gesture meant to communicate reasonableness. We disagreed. It happens in families. And the basis for his intended change. He was angry about something he thought I'd done, something involving the Meridian Foundation. He was wrong. What did he think you'd done? Osterbrook's jaw tightened very slightly, and then released. He thought I'd influenced the Foundation's grant decisions to benefit some of Felix Caro's business interests. Felix is on the board, and some of the Foundation's grant recipients have space in buildings Felix owns. Gerald thought that was improper. And was it? It's a coincidence, The grant recipients were selected on merit. I had nothing to do with it. I'm not even on the foundation's board. I'm simply Felix's friend, and Gerald decided that was sufficient reason to punish me. He paused. Gerald was a stubborn man with a gift for righteous anger. You visited him twice, in the week before his death. Once to discuss the trust, yes. We didn't resolve anything. And the second visit? Another pause, this one longer. To try again. He wouldn't see me. He had the doorman send me away. What day was that? Thursday. 3 days before he died. I wrote Thursday in my notebook, and thought about Mrs. Varela hearing, "That isn't good enough, and you know it," on Thursday afternoon, and wondered if those were words Gerald had said to Philip over the phone, earlier that day, before Philip showed up, and was turned away. "Mr. Osterbrook," Wolfe said, "where were you on Saturday evening, between the hours of 8 and midnight?" Philip Osterbrook's expression did something complicated. Offense, calculation, and a kind of wary respect, all moving through his features in rapid sequence. I was at Felix Caro's apartment. We had dinner. His housekeeper can confirm it. And after dinner? I stayed until approximately 11. Then I took a car home. A pause. My building has a doorman as well. No doubt. Thank you, Mr. Osterbrook. Wolfe picked up his book, which in this context functions as a gavel. That will be all for now. Osterbrook left with the careful composure of a man who has answered questions before, and knows that the danger is not in what you say, but in what you almost say. I showed him out, and watched him walk to the corner with the measured pace of someone deciding, with each step, what to tell the next person he spoke to. Warren Hood arrived at 2 in the afternoon, and was a different species entirely. Where Osterbrook was contained, Hood was warm, the practiced warmth of a man whose professional life depends on getting people to open their checkbooks with a feeling of pleasure. He was 55, silver-tongued, with a voice that had been trained for fundraising dinners and performed accordingly. He shook my hand, admired the brownstone, mentioned that he'd always appreciated Wolfe's reputation, and settled into the red chair as though arriving for a pleasant visit. Terrible business about Gerald, he said, before Wolfe had asked a thing. I can't tell you how much we miss him at the foundation. He was one of our most engaged board members. Engaged in what respect? Wolfe asked. In every respect. He took an active interest in the financials, in the programming decisions, in the grant process. Some board members are figureheads. Gerald never was. Was this active interest always welcome? Hood's smile stayed in place. What do you mean? An engaged board member who examines financial documents can be an asset, Wolfe said. He can also be an inconvenience. I'm asking which Gerald Bredall was to you. An asset, Mr. Wolfe. Entirely an asset. The smile was a fraction warmer, which is sometimes the same as a fraction colder. Gerald raised concerns recently about some of our expenditure reporting, which I was happy to clarify. It was a question of how we categorize certain administrative costs versus program costs. Genuinely arcane, and I don't blame him for being puzzled. Once I explained it, he was satisfied. He told his sister he was satisfied, Wolfe said. He then proceeded to arrange a meeting with his attorney to alter his will in a way that removed a man connected to your foundation's board. Does that read to you as a man who was satisfied? It was a very brief blink, but I've been watching people blink under Wolfe's questioning for long enough to know the difference between the involuntary kind and the kind that means something is being recalculated. I wasn't aware of the will matter, he said. You were not aware that Gerald Bredall intended to remove Philip Osterbrook from his mother's trust. No, Gerald didn't discuss personal financial matters with me. But he discussed foundation finances. Of course, that's entirely appropriate. And he found those finances satisfactory. Yes. Then, Wolfe said pleasantly, I wonder what he intended to ask Martin Geist about on the Monday after his death, if not the foundation finances that had been satisfactorily explained. The smile held, but something behind it had shifted. Warren Hood was a smart man, and smart men recognize when they're being walked into corners. "I wouldn't know," he said. "I'm sorry I can't be more helpful." After he left, I sat in my chair and looked at Wolfe, who was looking at the ceiling. "He's lying," I said. "He is omitting," Wolfe said, "which is lying's well-dressed cousin. But about what precisely remains to be determined." He lowered his gaze. "What did you observe about him physically, Archie?" I thought about it. His right hand. When you mentioned the Foundation finances, he put his right hand flat on his knee, and kept it there. Like he was making sure it didn't do anything he didn't want it to. Wolfe nodded slowly. A man controlling himself. Yes, he reached for his book. "Get me Felix Caro tomorrow morning. And also, find out everything you can about the Meridian Cultural Foundation's finances from public records. Their 990 filings will be available." "You think the money is the story?" "I think," Wolfe said, turning a page, "that Gerald Breadhall was a man who looked at numbers until they told him something, and that what they told him was enough to send him to a lawyer, alarm a cousin, and end, apparently, his life. The numbers are always the story, Archie. Everything else is decoration." The Meridian Cultural Foundation files its 990s, the nonprofit tax return, public record for anyone with patience and an internet connection, going back 12 years. I spent an evening with 3 years' worth of them and a legal pad, and came to breakfast the next morning with the particular satisfaction of a man who has found something in the place everyone forgot to hide it. Wolfe listened to my summary over soft-boiled eggs and toast, while the September morning tried to make up its mind about whether it wanted to be summer or fall. "In the Foundation's first 8 years," I said, "their program expenditure ratio, that's the percentage of spending that goes directly to charitable programs versus administration, ran consistently at about 72%. Healthy, in line with what the watchdog organizations like to see." "And subsequently?" 3 years ago it dropped to 61%. 2 years ago, 58. Last year, 49. I looked at my notes. Their total annual budget has grown. Grants received from outside donors increased significantly 3 years ago. But the money going to actual music programs has stayed nearly flat, while administrative costs have almost doubled. Wolfe finished an egg. "Doubled how?" "Line items for consulting services, facilities management, and what they call program development research. These didn't exist in the filings from 5 years ago. The program development research line alone accounts for $320,000 last year, and there's no corresponding description of what it produced." "And the consulting services?" "Listed as paid to a company called Ardent Management Group. No address in the filing, just the name and the amount." I'd looked it up. Ardent Management Group is registered in Delaware. The registered agent is a law firm. Beyond that, it's a wall. Wolfe was quiet for a moment, doing what he does, which is applying his rather extraordinary brain to the information available, and arranging it into patterns that lesser minds would need a flowchart for. 3 years ago, the budget grew and the ratios began to deteriorate. What else happened 3 years ago at the Foundation? Felix Caro joined the board. Wolfe said nothing, which is often the same as saying everything. Felix Caro arrived at 10:15 on Wednesday morning and immediately struck me as the most interesting person we'd spoken to so far, which is to say, the most dangerous. He was 46, with a compact, economical build, and the eyes of a man who has spent a lot of time assessing rooms and the people in them. Not handsome exactly, but the kind of face that photographs better than it looks in person, all angles and density. He was a real estate developer, middle market, with a portfolio of commercial properties in Brooklyn and Queens, and a few things in Manhattan that he was apparently very modest about. I'd done my research. His properties were profitable without being spectacular. His connection to Philip Osterbrook went back to Columbia, where they'd been roommates and apparently remained close in the way that men remain close when they've been useful to each other over a long period of time. He sat in the red chair, with the comfort of someone who's been briefed, which he had been. I told him the standard formula, that Wolfe was looking into Gerald Bredall's death on behalf of the family. "I'll help however I can," he said, and I believed him, because smart men always help however they can, which is up to the exact point where helping stops being useful to them. "Mr. Caro," Wolfe said, "you joined the Meridian Foundation's board 3 years ago." "That's right." "At whose invitation?" "Warren Whodunit's. I'd been a donor for several years, and Warren felt I could contribute in a more hands-on capacity." "And have you?" "I've tried. Board governance, financial oversight. It's not glamorous work, but it matters." "Indeed. Are you familiar with a company called Ardent Management Group?" Felix Caro's stillness was the kind that a man arrives at after some practice. He didn't freeze, didn't flinch. He simply was still. "I've heard the name," he said. "In what context?" "I believe they do some consulting work for the foundation. Facilities management, I think." $320,000 worth last year, Wolfe said. "Do you know who owns Ardent Management Group?" "I'm afraid I don't. That would be a question for Warren." "No doubt." Wolfe's tone was arid as a salt flat. "Tell me about your relationship with Philip Osterbrook." The shift in subject was calculated to produce a visible adjustment, and it did. Not dramatic, but there. A slight relaxation of the shoulders that meant Caro preferred this ground. "Old friends, 30 years. We don't always see eye to eye, but that's true of any friendship. Gerald Bredall believed that you and Mr. Osterbrook had worked together to influence foundation grant decisions in a way that benefited your property interests. The grant recipients apparently leased space from you." "That's absolutely not the case." The words came out smoothly, without heat. 4 of our grant recipients are located in buildings I own. That's because I made the space available to them at below-market rates, as part of my own charitable contributions. The grants they received were based on merit. I recused myself from those votes. "Did you?" "I did. Warren can confirm it. The minutes of the board meetings will confirm it." Gerald Bredall didn't seem to find the minutes convincing. Gerald was a good man who was being manipulated by Philip. Caro's voice stayed even. "They had a personal dispute. Philip told me about it. Gerald was angry about something and looking for ammunition. He looked at the foundation and convinced himself there was something wrong when there wasn't." "And the meeting Gerald arranged with his attorney for the Monday after his death?" "I'm not aware of it." "He intended to remove your friend from the trust. That meeting was arranged on Thursday." "Your friend visited Gerald on Thursday and was refused entry." Wolfe paused. "Did Philip Osterbrook tell you about that on Thursday evening?" There was a pause, shorter than Osterbrook's had been, and better managed, but present. "We spoke, yes." Philip was upset. "Was he at your apartment on Saturday evening?" "Yes. We had dinner." "Until what time?" "He left around 11. "And you remained at home?" "Yes." Wolfe nodded slowly. "One more question, Mr. Caro. Gerald Bredall's index of the night he died, his behavior, his state of mind. Do you have any information?" "None. I wasn't in contact with Gerald." After he was gone, I sat back and tapped my notebook against my knee, and felt the particular intellectual dissatisfaction of an interview that produced no obvious lie and no obvious truth. "He's better than Who'd," I said. "Considerably," Wolfe agreed. "He's had more practice. He rang for beer. But he made one error." "Which was?" "He knew the grant recipients leased space in his buildings. I stated it as a general fact. He specified the number, 4. A man who had not already known this was being examined wouldn't know the number off the top of his head. I thought about that. He's been counting. He's been preparing. The question is, for what?" Wolfe accepted his beer from Fritz, who retreated with the efficiency of a good soldier. "And Archie, find out who owns Ardent Management Group. I don't care if it takes a lawyer and 2 days. Find out." The murder, as I came to think of it, and I was increasingly comfortable using that word, had a texture to it that I was starting to be able to feel. even if I couldn't yet trace its exact outline. Gerald Bredall had found something in the Foundation's numbers. He'd been satisfied by Warren Hood's explanation just long enough to relax. And then something. A phone call, another document, a second look at something he'd set aside, had put him back on the trail. He'd called his attorney. He'd told his sister something was wrong. He'd written a note and tucked it behind a drawer. And on Saturday night, he'd ended up on the terrace he never used. The question of how someone gets a man who is afraid of heights onto a terrace he avoids is an interesting one. You could trick him, lure him out somehow. You could force him, but that implies a physical struggle, and the building's doorman would have noticed someone capable of a physical struggle coming through the lobby. Or you could already be there when things went wrong. Already in the apartment. Already familiar enough that Gerald opened his door without alarm. Philip Osterbrook had a key. Warren Hood and Felix Caro had charm, and presumably access to a phone. The dark-haired woman Eddie the doorman hadn't recognized had come and gone in under 20 minutes and hadn't been seen since. I thought about all of this on the subway to see Sylvia Whodunit, the gallery owner who also sat on the Foundation's board, and arrived at her 53rd Street gallery in a mood that I would describe as productively suspicious. Sylvia Whodunit was 60, elegant, and immediately more candid than anyone else I'd spoken to, which made me trust her about 60%, because people who seem candid in the middle of a murder investigation are either innocent or the best liars in the room. "You want to know about the Foundation's finances?" she said, before I'd asked about them. "I've been uncomfortable with the last 2 years' numbers. I raised it with Warren." She poured tea without asking if I wanted it, which I found refreshing. He explained the administrative cost increases as capacity building. New staff, systems upgrades, strategic planning costs. "Did that satisfy you?" "Not entirely, but I'm a gallery owner, not a forensic accountant." She handed me the tea. When Gerald started asking questions about the same things, I was glad. He was more persistent than I am, and better with numbers. And then he stopped asking. She looked at me steadily. "And then he died." "Yes." She put her own cup down. "Mr. Goodwin, I will tell you something I haven't told the police because no one asked me. 3 weeks ago, 2 days before Gerald died, I received a phone call from a man who didn't give his name. He told me that if I continued to support Gerald Bredall's position on the Foundation board, I would find that a certain matter from my personal past would become professionally inconvenient. I stopped writing. "A threat?" "Yes." "Did you recognize the voice?" "No. It was careful and quiet. Not aggressive, almost polite." She picked up her cup. "I've been thinking about it ever since." "And you didn't tell the police?" "They didn't ask, and I couldn't prove anything." She looked out at the gallery floor, where a large canvas in grays and purples hung under careful lighting. "Gerald died 2 days later, and I thought, maybe I'm being paranoid. Maybe it was someone with a personal grudge. Maybe it had nothing to do with anything." She looked back at me. "But now you're here." I put my notebook in my pocket and stood up. "Mrs. Donate, if anyone contacts you again, in any form, I'd like you to call this number immediately." I gave her one of my cards with Wolfe's office line written on the back. "Don't discuss this with anyone at the Foundation until I tell you it's safe to do so." She nodded, and I believed she would. Some people you can tell. On the street, I stood in the September afternoon and thought about a polite, quiet voice on a telephone, and about the escalating specificity of what we were dealing with. This wasn't an angry cousin with a grievance and an opportune key. This was organized. This had planning. I went back to the brownstone and gave Wolfe everything I had, and he sat and listened with his eyes closed, and when I finished, there was a silence that had a different quality than his usual silences, something focused at the center of it, like a lens coming into alignment. The dark-haired woman, he said, without opening his eyes. I can't find her. Look harder. He opened his eyes. Ardent Management Group? Working on it. My contact at the Secretary of State's office says Delaware will take another day. Then tomorrow. He closed his eyes again. Archie, what was Gerald Breadall's emotional state in the days before his death, in your assessment of the evidence? I thought about it. Not panicked. Not desperate. Mrs. Varela said, worried like a man doing arithmetic. Donat says he was persistent. He arranged a lawyer meeting for Monday. That's the move of a man with a plan, not a man who's running scared. Yes, Wolfe said. Which means whoever killed him didn't wait for him to carry out that plan. They had a window, Friday to Monday, and they used Saturday night. He opened his eyes. Someone knew about the Monday appointment. Martin Geist? Or someone Geist told? Or someone who found out another way? He reached for his book. Find out who Martin Geist spoke to between Thursday and Saturday. The September afternoon turned into evening, and Fritz made something with veal that deserved a better context than a murder investigation, and I ate it anyway, and thought about windows and the people who use them. Wolfe's interrogations are not, technically, interrogations. They are conversations in which only one party knows where the conversation is going, and the other party gradually discovers this, and is, by that point, too committed to the exchange to retreat gracefully. I've watched him do it for years, and it still impresses me. The way a very good card trick still impresses you, even when you know there's a card up someone's sleeve. Because knowing it is there doesn't tell you which card it is. He summoned everyone on Thursday. Philip Osterbrook, Warren Hood, Felix Caro, and Sylvia Donat. Separately, at hourly intervals, beginning at 2 in the afternoon. He told me the order mattered, and I believed him, because with Wolfe the order of everything matters. Osterbrook came first. He settled into the red chair with slightly less ease than the first time, which told me he'd been thinking, and that thinking had made him careful. Mr. Osterbrook, Wolfe said, I want to ask you about Ardent Management Group. Something happened to Osterbrook's expression. It was the kind of thing that happens in less than a second, but leaves a mark, like a very small earthquake. I'm sorry? Ardent Management Group. They provide consulting services to the Meridian Foundation. Are you familiar with them? I may have heard Felix mention them. The answer came back a beat too carefully. I don't have direct involvement with the foundation. No, but you are friends with 2 of its board members, Mr. Caro and Mr. Hood. I know Warren socially, yes, less well than Felix. Ardent Management Group, Wolfe said conversationally, is registered in Delaware, through a registered agent. The beneficial owner, according to documents my colleague obtained this morning, is a holding company registered in Nevada called Silvergate Property Holdings. He paused. Silvergate Property Holdings lists 2 officers, Felix Caro and a man named David Osterbrook. Philip Osterbrook sat completely still. David Osterbrook, Wolfe continued, is your son. My son is. David is 24. He's not. He is listed as an officer of a company that receives substantial annual payments from a foundation, on whose board your closest friend sits, and whose governance you allegedly influenced. This is what your cousin Gerald discovered. I didn't. He stopped, started again. David's involvement with Silvergate is nominal. Felix asked him to. Mr. Osterbrook, Wolfe's voice was gentle. I suggest that you say nothing further on this subject until you have spoken with an attorney. What I need to know from you right now is one thing only. He leaned forward slightly. Who knew that Gerald had arranged to meet Martin Geist on Monday? Osterbrook's composure was gone now, not shattered, but cracked in ways that showed what was underneath, which was a frightened man who'd made choices he hadn't fully thought through, and was now looking at where they led. Gerald told me on the phone, he said, very quietly, the call that week. He said he was meeting with Geist on Monday, and that I should clear out whatever was in my name before then, because he intended to pursue not just the trust change, but referral to the DA's office. You told Felix Caro. It wasn't a question. Osterbrook looked at his hands. Yes. When? Thursday. When I went to his apartment. After Gerald refused to see you at the building. Yes. After Philip Osterbrook left, moving with the deliberate care of a man navigating us, I looked at Wolfe across the room. So Caro knew, I said. Caro knew. Who'd may have known. And one of them used Saturday night to prevent Monday morning. He tapped his desk. Show Mr. Whood in. HR. Warren Whood came in carrying his warmth like an umbrella, even though the weather had clearly changed. He sat down and looked at Wolfe with the professional attentiveness of a man used to reading rooms. Whood, Ardent Management Group. The smile this time was different. Smaller, more defensive. He'd had more time than Osterbrook to expect this name. Yes? Ardent received $320,000 from the foundation last year, and comparative amounts in the 2 previous years. Through Ardent, the money passed to Silvergate Property Holdings, of which Felix Caro is a beneficial owner. This is, under the laws governing nonprofit organizations, a serious irregularity. I'm not aware of the ownership structure of our vendors. That is either a lie or a dereliction of your fiduciary duty as executive director, Wolfe said, without raising his voice. I prefer the former, since it implies at least some consciousness of wrongdoing, which the latter does not. Which would you prefer? Whood said nothing. Let me propose an alternative, Wolfe said. You knew. Felix Caro proposed the arrangement. You implemented it, and Gerald Brettall began to see what it was. Ye explained it away in the meeting that satisfied him temporarily, but Gerald was not, in the end, satisfied. He arranged to see a lawyer. You told Felix. I didn't tell Felix anything. Who'd stopped. You told someone. The silence in the office had texture. Outside a bus went by. Fritz could be faintly heard in the kitchen. The September afternoon arranged itself around the moment and waited. There was a woman, Who'd said, at last. She works for Felix. She handles his certain communications. Her name is Diana Creel. I wrote Diana Creel and circled it twice. She called me on Thursday, Who'd continued. She asked me if I knew about Gerald's plans with his attorney. I said yes. She said she was just checking. He looked up. That's all. That is all I said and all I knew. And you thought nothing of it? I told myself it was just... He stopped again. When he spoke, his voice had lost the professional warmth entirely, leaving something raw underneath. When Gerald died, I told myself it was an accident. I chose to believe that. What a very convenient article of faith, Wolfe said. He dismissed Whood and called for Felix Caro. Felix Caro sat down in the red chair and did something none of the others had done. He looked at me first, then at Wolfe, and made a small, precise assessment of the situation that registered in his eyes as a kind of acknowledgement. He knew we had something. He was deciding what to do about it. Ardent Management Group, Wolfe said. I expected you'd get there, Caro said. Delaware registrations are public. Silvergate Property Holdings, your company and young David Osterbrook. David's involvement is administrative. He does some bookkeeping. The relationship between Ardent's work for the foundation and my property interests is self-dealing, Wolfe said. The correct legal term is self-dealing. A board member directing foundation funds to a company in which he has a beneficial interest. Gerald Brettall knew this, or knew enough to bring it to a lawyer. Caro nodded slowly. He thought he did. He did. You knew about his meeting with Geist. Philip told me. And Diana Creel? For the first time, something shifted in Caro's eyes. What about her? She spoke to Warren Whood on Thursday, confirming Gerald's plans. Wolfe folded his hands. Mr. Caro, where was Diana Creel on Saturday evening? She's not relevant to this. A dark-haired woman in her 30s visited Gerald Brettall 2 days before his death, and left in under 20 minutes. The building doorman didn't recognize her. Is Diana Creel dark-haired and in her 30s? Caro was very still. She didn't visit Gerald. The doorman disagrees. The doorman described a type, not a person. There are a great many dark-haired women in their 30s. Most of them don't work for men with a strong financial motive to ensure Gerald Bradall didn't speak to his attorney on Monday morning. Wolfe leaned back. Mr. Caro, I will tell you what I think. I think Diana Creel visited Gerald Bradall. I think she was sent to determine his state of mind, to perhaps attempt persuasion of some kind. I think that visit was unsuccessful, and that on Saturday evening, Gerald Bradall's apartment was accessed by someone he trusted, and Gerald ended up on a terrace he had not voluntarily stood on in 4 years. Caro looked at him for a long moment. You don't have proof of any of this. Not yet, Wolfe said. But I have a great deal of something that tends, in my experience, to lead to proof. I have the truth. He reached for his beer. You are free to leave, Mr. Caro. I suggest you do not leave the city. After the door closed, I looked at the office around me, the books, the globe, the pattern of afternoon light, and thought about a man who'd found an inconvenient truth in a column of numbers and paid for it with a terrace. We need Diana Creel, I said. Yes, Wolfe said, and we need what she said to Gerald Bradall, because I suspect whatever was said in that visit told Gerald something crucial, not about the foundation, but about who was really running things. He looked at the index card still on his desk. Ask who really runs it. Find her, Archie, quietly and quickly. Finding Diana Creel was, as it turned out, 3 days' work that I'll compress here in the interest of everyone's patience, including my own. She wasn't hard to find in the sense that she existed on paper. LinkedIn had her as a private client services coordinator in a professional services firm called Caro Group LLC, which was clearly a separate entity from Caro's development company, and appeared to exist primarily to coordinate exactly the kind of certain communications that Who'd had described. She was 34, dark-haired, and lived in a building on West End Avenue. She was hard to find in the sense that when I went to her building, her doorman informed me she'd gone out of town 2 days earlier, which was 1 day after my visit to Caro's apartment. I'm sure that was a coincidence. I put a man named Saul Panzer on it, because Saul is the best operative in the city, and has a face like a comfortable piece of furniture. Nobody remembers it, which means he can go anywhere. While Saul looked for Diana Creel, I looked for Carl Reeves, the doorman who'd been on duty the night Gerald Bradall died. He was working the evening shift at a building on East 65th, and he talked to me in a small office off the lobby, with the door half open, and the posture of a man who's been waiting for someone to ask him something, and is relieved it's finally happening. I wasn't going to go to the police, he said. I figured they'd ask me, but they never came. They talked to Eddie, and I guess Eddie told them what he knew, and they stopped there. What happened that night, Mr. Reeves? Mr. Bradall went out around 8. I let him out. He looked, not worried, not scared, like he was going to meet someone he'd agreed to see. He said good evening to me the same as always, and walked east. And when did he come back? 9:50. I let him in. He wasn't drunk. I want to be clear about that. He wasn't stumbling, like someone had told him something that hadn't finished landing yet. He nodded at me and went straight to the elevator. Was anyone else in the building around that time? Carl Reeves was quiet for a moment. About 10 minutes after Mr. Bradall came in, a man came to the door. I didn't let him in through the front. I wasn't supposed to admit anyone without resident permission. But he showed me a key, a physical key, to the building's side entrance. He said he was a friend of Mr. Bradall's, and he'd left something in the apartment earlier. Describe him. 50, maybe a little older, slim, silver hair, very neat. He looked at me steadily. Well-dressed. I didn't show him a photograph, because I didn't have one on me, and also because I didn't need one. Did you tell him to call up to the apartment? I tried to. He said Mr. Bradall had specifically asked him to use the side entrance and not disturb anyone, and he had the key. Reeves's face carried the specific shame of a man who knows he made the wrong call and can't take it back. I let him in. I shouldn't have. I know I shouldn't have. What time did he leave? I don't know. I didn't see him leave. I was at the desk, and there's no sightline to the side exit from the desk. He paused. The call came in just after midnight. Someone from upstairs called down about a noise from the street. That's when I knew. I thanked him and walked out into the night air of East 65th Street and stood on a sidewalk for a long moment. Slim, 50 or a little older, silver hair, very neat, well-dressed. That description fit Philip Osterbrook. It also fit Felix Caro, whose hair I now recalled was dark, but it had the kind of build. It also, with some latitude, fit Warren Hood. He answered on the third ring, which means he was in the office and available, since he refuses to carry the phone himself. There was a man with a key, I said. A building key, not the apartment key, a side entrance key. A pause. Who has a key to the building's side entrance? I'll find out tomorrow. The building management office won't be open tonight. Do so first thing. Another pause. How was Gerald when he returned at 9:50? Carl Reeves said he looked like someone who'd been told something that hadn't finished landing. A much longer pause. He went out at 8, Wolfe said, mostly to himself. He met someone. He came back changed. A pause. Archie, find out where Gerald Bredall went on Saturday night, between 8 and 9:50. He walked east. East from the Caldwell Arms, puts him toward Lexington and Park. He wasn't drunk. He was meeting someone. A pause. Credit card records. Get Parker to get us an emergency court order if needed. On a Saturday night 2 weeks ago, he might have paid cash, but try. Wolfe hung up. Parker came through on the court order in 48 hours, by which time Saul Panzer had located Diana Creel in a rented house in Connecticut, and I'd driven up in the Heron to have a conversation she very much didn't want to have. She was, as advertised, dark-haired and in her 30s, and she met me at the door of the rented house with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this and had spent 3 days trying to decide how to play it. Mrs. Bredall's people, she said. Mr. Wolfe's people, same general direction. I smiled. Miss Creel, I'm not going to threaten you or make promises I can't keep. I'm going to tell you what we know, and you're going to tell me if we've got the details right, because we're going to get this story regardless. And the difference between talking now and talking later is the difference between a witness and an accessory. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she stepped back from the door. We sat in a rented living room with rented furniture, and she told me what I'd begun to suspect. She had visited Gerald Bredall on the Wednesday before his death. Not to threaten him, to offer him a deal. Felix Caro had sent her to tell Gerald that the irregularities in the Foundation's finances could be explained to his satisfaction, that David Osterbrook's involvement with Silvergate was a misunderstanding that would be formally corrected, and that Philip would agree to step away from the trust voluntarily if Gerald withdrew his plans to contact the DA. Gerald said no, I said. She said no. He also said something else. She folded her hands. He said he wasn't going to the DA about the Foundation. He was going because he knew what the Foundation was actually funding. I waited. He said he'd found payments from Ardent that corresponded to specific dates when certain city contract approvals were issued. He thought the Foundation was being used to funnel money to city officials. Political corruption, not just self-dealing. I wrote that down very carefully. He found that in the financials? He'd found a pattern, enough of a pattern that he was going to bring it to Martin Geist and ask Geist to advise him on going to the DA or the FBI. She looked at her hands. When I told Felix what Gerald had said, Felix was very quiet for a very long time. And then Gerald died. She looked up. I didn't know that was going to happen. I want to be very clear about that. What do you think happened? She was quiet for a long moment. Felix called Philip. That's what I think. I think Felix told Philip what Gerald was going to do, Not just the trust, not just the financial impropriety, but the political corruption piece. And I think Philip went to Gerald's building that night with a key and a conversation he needed to finish. And Gerald let him in. Gerald loved Philip. Whatever else was happening between them, they'd been close their whole lives. She looked out the window at the Connecticut trees. That's the worst part. I drove back to the city with the tape recorder running through what she'd told me, and thought about what it means when the truth is worse than the suspicion, and about a man who'd opened his door to someone he loved. The credit card records confirmed Gerald had eaten dinner at a restaurant on Lexington at 8:30, alone, which meant the meeting I'd hypothesized hadn't happened. He'd gone out alone, had dinner, and come back changed, which meant something had happened in the restaurant, or on the way back. We got the answer from a long shot. I canvassed the stretch of East 68th between Lexington and the Caldwell Arms, and found in a small bar 2 doors from the building a bartender who remembered a man matching Gerald's description, sitting in a corner booth at 9:15 and taking a phone call that lasted 10 minutes and left him staring at the table for a long time before he paid his bill and left. Gerald Breedall had received a call on his way home. Someone had told him something in those 10 minutes. We got Gerald's phone records through Parker. The 9:15 call had come from a prepaid cell number, the kind that doesn't trace. But the call before it, at 9:02, had been from a number we recognized. Martin Geist. Gerald's attorney had called him at 9 p.m., and they'd spoken for 12 minutes. And then Gerald had received a call on a prepaid phone. When I called Martin Geist the following morning, he told me, after suitable preliminary resistance, that he had called Gerald on Saturday night to inform him that he'd received a call from a man who claimed to have information about the foundation that Gerald needed to hear before meeting with Geist on Monday. He'd passed along a number for Gerald to call. The prepaid cell. Someone had fed Geist a misdirection, used Geist's credibility to get Gerald to pick up the phone, and then, we could only speculate about the call itself, told Gerald something that sent him home shaken enough for Carl Reeves to notice. And then, 40 minutes later, a well-dressed man with silver hair and a key to the side entrance had walked into the Caldwell Arms. I had everything I needed. I went back to the brownstone and laid it all out for Wolfe, who sat behind his desk with his eyes closed and his fingers laced, and listened without interrupting, which is one of the highest compliments he pays anyone. When I finished, he was silent for nearly a minute. "It's Osterbrook," he said. "That's my read. The key, the access, the personal relationship that got the door opened, the knowledge of Gerald's plans." He opened his eyes. "But we need the prepaid call and what it said, because that call is what drove Gerald onto the terrace. Not force, not a struggle, something said in that call." "How do we get that?" I asked. Wolfe looked at me with the expression he gets when he's about to require me to do something I won't enjoy. "We give Philip Osterbrook a reason to tell us." Wolfe's working theories are not hypotheses in the scientific sense. He doesn't float them provisionally and test them. He builds them the way a master cabinet maker builds a piece of furniture, precisely, with an understanding of how each joint bears weight, and when he presents them, even to himself, they are already load-bearing structures. He spent the next morning in the plant rooms, which is where he does his best thinking, despite, or because of, the fact that he appears to be doing nothing but examining foliage. I spent it, reviewing everything we had, and trying to find the gaps. We had motive. The corruption scheme Gerald had uncovered was potentially worth millions in city contracts, which meant the people involved had everything to lose from exposure. We had access. Philip Osterbrook had a key to the apartment and a key to the side entrance, obtained years earlier. We had opportunity. The time window was established. Carl Reeves had placed him at the building, and his alibi at Felix Caro's dinner party ended at 11, 90 minutes before Gerald died. What we didn't have was the mechanism of the death itself, and that mattered in two ways. Legally, because the police had ruled it an accident, and practically, because I needed to understand how a man terrified of heights ends up on a terrace. I went back to Gerald's apartment one more time, with Anton Beth's sighing cooperation, and stood on the terrace and thought about it from the simplest possible angle. Gerald comes home at 9:50, changed and troubled. His cousin arrives at 10 o'clock, let in by a doorman who's been given a plausible story and a building key. Gerald lets him in, because of course he does, because this is his cousin of 47 years. The same cousin he'd shared a beach house with in summers. The same cousin he'd driven to the hospital when Philip's mother had her stroke. They sit in the apartment and talk. Philip tries one more time to reason with Gerald, or threaten him, or find some angle that works. Gerald, who was a stubborn man with a gift for righteous anger, says no. Says no to all of it. And then what? I looked at the glass doors to the terrace. They opened inward. The latch was simple. A man who didn't want to go out there would still need to approach within a few feet to see if anyone had tampered with the latch. I thought about what you'd say, and stood in the apartment and imagined the conversation, and it came to me slowly, the way things come when you stop pushing and just let the room tell you what happened in it. You wouldn't force a man onto a terrace. Not if you were smart. Not if you wanted it to look like an accident. You'd get him to the glass doors by talking about the latch. You'd say, "Gerald, someone's been on the terrace. Look at the latch. It's been forced." And Gerald, who was troubled and frightened and whose mind was on other things, would go to the doors and look, and his cousin would open them, being helpful, not threatening, and step out to show him. And Gerald would follow a step, just a step, because he trusted the person he was with. There, with the railing at hip height and the dark street below, something fast and irreversible would happen. The scratches on the left anchor. Gerald grabbing the railing as he went over, one hand catching for an instant, dragging metal against metal, and then nothing. I stood on the terrace for a long time. I didn't enjoy it. Wolfe was in his chair when I got back, with the day's mail and a beer, and the settled look of a man whose thinking has completed itself, and is now waiting for the world to catch up. It was staged as an inspection, I said. Something about the latch. Something to get him to approach the doors. Wolfe nodded slowly. Yes, that fits. We can't prove what was said. No, but we don't need to prove the words. He set down his beer. We need Osterbrook to tell us, and he will tell us, if we give him the correct reason. Which is? Fear. He picked up the beer again. Philip Osterbrook is afraid of two things: criminal exposure for the financial scheme, and criminal exposure for murder. Currently, he believes he is only at risk for the former, because the police ruled Gerald's death an accident. If we can convince him that we know he was in the building that night, not suspect, but know, he will bargain. And in bargaining, he will give us what we need to prove the second thing. He's not going to walk in here and confess. No, but he will walk in here and make a deal, which amounts to the same thing, operationally. He folded his hands. Invite him. Tell him we have a witness who places him at the Caldwell Arms at 10 p.m. on Saturday. Don't identify the witness. Let him calculate. Carl Reeves hadn't technically, positively identified Osterbrook. He'd given a description. But Philip Osterbrook didn't know that, and Wolfe's instruction to me had been to tell him we had a witness, which was true, and that the witness placed him at the building, which was also true, and to leave the calibration of those facts to Osterbrook's own considerable anxiety. I called him that afternoon, and delivered the message, and in the silence that followed I could hear a man doing arithmetic in his head that wasn't coming out right. "When does Mr. Wolfe want to see me?" he said finally. "Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. I'll need to bring my attorney. Bring whoever you like," I said cheerfully. "We'll have tea." While Wolfe and I were having this conversation, Saul Panzer was doing something I'd asked him to do 2 days earlier, which was to find out who had made the prepaid cell call to Gerald Bradall on Saturday at 9:15. Saul doesn't work miracles. Nobody does, despite what the detective novels suggest. But he is extremely good at finding the people who know things. What Saul found at 11 o'clock that evening was this. The prepaid cell had been purchased at a drugstore in Midtown on the Thursday before Gerald's death. The purchase hadn't been on a credit card, but the drugstore had security cameras. I won't bore you with the technical details of how Saul obtained that footage, but I will note that it involved neither illegal activity nor anything Wolfe would have disapproved of, and that the image was clear enough to show a man in his mid-50s with silver hair and a compact build, purchasing a prepaid phone and paying cash. It was Felix Caro. Caro had made the call. Caro had said something to Gerald on Saturday night that sent him home in the state Carl Reeves observed. And then Philip had used a key to finish what the phone call had started. I delivered this information to Wolfe at 11:15, and he received it in the way he receives information that confirms his reasoning, with a satisfied precision, like a locksmith hearing the last tumbler click. Then we have them both, I said. We have the shape, he said. Tomorrow we get the details from Osterbrook, and then we gather everyone and let the picture assemble itself. He reached for the book he'd set aside. Get some sleep, Archie. Tomorrow will require all of your attention. I went to bed and lay in the dark, thinking about Gerald Breadhall making a joke on a Tuesday and being dead on a Saturday, and about the particular kind of loneliness of being killed by someone you loved. Philip Osterbrook arrived at 10 o'clock with a lawyer named Marcus Webb, who had the expensive haircut and watchful eyes of a man who charges by the hour and earns every cent. They sat in the red chairs. I'd pulled up an extra, and Wolfe looked at them both with the same cordial formality he extends to everyone who occupies that position. Mr. Webb, Wolfe said, your client is here to discuss what he knows about certain events surrounding Gerald Breadhall's death. I want to be clear about the purpose of this meeting. I'm not the police. I hold no legal authority, and nothing said here is admissible in a court of law without your client's further consent. What I am is a man who already knows a great deal, and who is offering your client the opportunity to complete the picture before I share what I have with the appropriate authorities. Webb looked at Osterbrook, who gave a very small nod. Mr. Osterbrook, Wolfe said, were you at the Caldwell Arms on Saturday, October the 3rd, between the hours of 10 and midnight? A pause. Then, yes. Did you enter the building using a key to the side entrance? Yes. And did you enter Gerald Breadhall's apartment? A longer pause. Webb put a hand briefly on his client's arm, then removed it. Yes, Osterbrook said. Tell me what happened. What Philip Osterbrook told us over the next 35 minutes, while Marcus Webb took notes, and I took separate notes, and Wolfe listened with the focused stillness of a man hearing a story he already knows, and is checking for the places where reality diverges from reason. What he told us was the following. Felix Caro had called him Friday night, and told him what Diana Creel had reported from the visit to Gerald. That Gerald had found evidence of what Felix called the city arrangement, which was the political bribery scheme that the Foundation had been used to facilitate. Felix told Philip that Gerald was a threat not just to Philip's inheritance, but to both of them, since Philip had known about the arrangement and done nothing. Silence, as Felix put it, had a value, and its absence was a liability. Felix had made the Saturday call to Gerald. I asked what he'd said, and Osterbrook told me, and I will tell you now because it matters to the shape of things. Felix had told Gerald that Philip had been the one to propose the corruption scheme, that Philip had brought Felix into it, had arranged the Foundation connections, had set up Silvergate to route the money. All of this was a lie, constructed to ensure that Gerald's principal anger remained directed at Philip rather than at Felix. And also, I later understood, to ensure that if Gerald died, Philip would be the most obvious suspect, and Felix would be protected. Gerald had sat in that bar on Lexington and heard his cousin named as the architect of a political corruption scheme, and he'd gone home believing it. Whether it changed anything practically, he was still going to see Geist on Monday. Didn't matter. What mattered was what he believed when Philip walked through his door at 10 o'clock. He was different, Osterbrook said, and his voice had something in it that wasn't calculation or self-protection. He looked at me differently, like I was a stranger. He paused. I tried to explain. I told him Felix had lied to him. It wasn't me. It was Felix's arrangement. I'd only known about it after the fact. Gerald wouldn't hear it. He kept saying he'd always known, somehow he'd always known, that he stopped. That you had it in you, I said. Something like that. He was quiet for a moment. He went to the glass doors. He was upset and pacing, and I was trying to talk to him. And he went to the doors, and he said he needed air, that he needed to think. He opened the doors himself, Wolfe said. He opened them and stepped out. I followed him. I was trying to explain. Osterbrook looked at his hands. We were both on the terrace. He turned his back on me. He was leaning on the railing, looking down. I put my hand on his shoulder. And? The silence lasted a long time. I don't know, Osterbrook said. I don't know what I intended. I know what happened. His voice was very flat. He went over. My hand was on his shoulder, and he went over. Did you push him? Wolfe asked. Another silence. I applied pressure. I don't know if. He went over. Marcus Webb closed his notebook. Mr. Wolfe, Webb said, I think we've reached the limits of what my client can usefully say without formal legal protection. We have, Wolfe agreed. I've heard enough. He looked at Osterbrook, and his expression was not unkind, which surprised me, though it probably shouldn't have. Wolfe rarely takes satisfaction in the human cost of what he uncovers. Mr. Osterbrook, one question only, and your answer will not change what I do with this information. Why did you go to Gerald's apartment? What did you actually intend when you walked in? Philip Osterbrook looked at his hands for a long moment. I wanted to make him understand, he said, very quietly, that I wasn't who Felix said I was, that I hadn't done what Gerald thought. He paused. I wanted my cousin back. It was, I thought, probably the truest thing he'd said. After they left, Webb steering Osterbrook toward what I imagined would be a very expensive and very necessary set of conversations, I sat across from Wolfe and looked at the red chairs and thought about the distance between what people intend and what they do. Caro set him up, I said, every step of the way. Yes, Felix Caro understood from the beginning that if Gerald's death was investigated, Philip would bear the weight of it. Philip had the motive, the access, the history. Caro arranged the Saturday call to ensure Gerald would have Philip's name uppermost in his mind. He arranged the dinner party to give Philip an alibi that ended at 11, leaving a window that incriminated Philip. He paused. Caro even told Philip what Felix had said on the phone call, knowing that telling Philip would almost guarantee Philip would go to Gerald that night. He used Philip to kill Gerald and kill himself. A remarkably efficient solution. Wolfe's voice held the particular chill it reaches when he finds something simultaneously admirable and reprehensible. Philip, if it comes to it, will claim he didn't intend to push. A hand on a shoulder, a stumble, the railing too low. A jury will be uncertain. Felix Caro, on the other hand, can claim he knew nothing of any of it. Unless Osterbrook gives him up, which he will now do, because Marcus Webb will explain to him the difference between manslaughter under extreme emotional provocation and conspiracy to commit murder, and the value of Felix Caro's company on the former charge. He reached for his beer. Tomorrow, we assemble them all, including Caro, especially Caro. He doesn't yet know what Philip has told us. He will come in believing he is still insulated. Wolfe drank. It would be a shame to disabuse him of that before he's in the room. I've seen Wolfe do this 11 times over the years. The gathering, the room full of people who'd rather be anywhere else, the slow and methodical assembly of a case, like a man building a clock from its component parts, and then winding it so everyone can hear it tick. Each time, it's the same in structure and entirely different in texture, because the crimes are different, and the people are different, and the particular way truth feels when it arrives in a room is different each time. This one felt heavy. They came in on Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Constance Breadall, the client, who sat at the far end of the room and kept her hands still with obvious effort. Philip Osterbrook and Marcus Webb. Warren Hood, whose professional warmth had by now entirely abandoned him. Felix Caro, who came in last and took the only remaining chair with the composure of a man who has decided what version of events he is presenting and intends to present it. And Sylvia Donath, who had asked to be there, and whom I had included because she deserved to hear it. Inspector Kramer from Homicide was in the kitchen with a cup of Fritz's coffee and instructions not to come in unless I knocked twice on the door, because Wolfe had done the city's work for them and had certain preferences about how the results were delivered. Wolfe looked at the room. "Thank you all for coming," he said, in the tone of a man who is entirely aware that thanks are not what this occasion requires. "I will be brief where brevity is possible, and complete where completeness is necessary. I ask that you refrain from interruptions until I have finished, at which point you may say whatever seems useful." He picked up a glass of water, no beer for this I noticed, which means he was working, and set it down without drinking. "Gerald Breadall did not fall from his terrace by accident," he said. "He was placed in a position where he would go to that terrace willingly, in the company of someone he trusted, and where that trust was used to kill him." He began, and for the next 40 minutes he told the story the way he tells stories, with precision, without drama, each piece placed in its sequence, and its connection to the adjacent pieces made explicit. The Foundation's finances, the self-dealing scheme, Ardent Management Group, and Silvergate, Gerald's discovery, and his conversations with his sister, with his attorney, with Diana Creel. Felix Caro's face throughout this was extraordinary to watch. He maintained an expression of polite concern, with the discipline of a man who has rehearsed it, but there were moments when Wolfe named Silvergate, when he named Diana Creel, when he described the security footage from the drugstore, when something moved under the surface of that composure, like something large moving under still water. Philip Osterbrook sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the floor. "The call at 9:15 on Saturday night," Wolfe said, "was made by Felix Caro from a prepaid cell phone purchased in cash on Thursday. In that call, Mr. Caro told Gerald that Philip Osterbrook was the architect of the Foundation's corruption scheme. A lie designed to ensure that if Gerald was killed that night, Philip would appear to be the most obvious culprit." "That's absurd," Caro said, and his voice was very controlled. "I made no such call. The phone was purchased on camera. The image will be available to the police shortly." Wolfe looked at him for a moment. "Additionally, Mr. Caro, your assistant Diana Creel has given a statement. She will be speaking with authorities within the next 24 hours. Something shifted in Caro's eyes. He looked, for the first time, at Philip Osterbrook, and what passed between them in that glance was long and specific, and had the quality of a long conversation compressed to a second. Osterbrook looked away first. "Philip Osterbrook," Wolfe continued, "entered the Caldwell Arms at 10 p.m., using a building key, and went to his cousin's apartment. The conversation that followed ended on the terrace. Whether the final physical act was deliberate or an impulsive extension of 30 years of friendship gone wrong, I cannot say with certainty, and it is not my place to say. That determination belongs to a court." He paused. "What I can say is that it was not an accident in any meaningful sense. Gerald Breadall did not go onto that terrace alone. It was very small, and she controlled it immediately, but it was there, and it was the sound of a grief that finally had something solid to attach to. Felix Caro," Wolfe said, "is, in my assessment, the more culpable party. He designed the corruption scheme. He arranged the call intended to provoke Philip into action. He arranged Philip's alibi at the dinner party and left a window that would implicate Philip if things went wrong. He constructed, with considerable intelligence, a situation in which one man would kill another and bear most of the legal consequence for it. He looked at Caro steadily. The corruption scheme itself, the payments to city officials, will be a matter for federal investigators, who will find Mr. Caro's cooperation considerably more valuable if it is offered early. Caro said nothing. He was doing the arithmetic, and the numbers weren't coming out well. Warren Hood had aged approximately 10 years since sitting down. I knew about the self-dealing. I didn't know about the city arrangement. I believe you, Wolfe said, without warmth. Ignorance of a crime is not innocence of all wrongdoing. You will have to negotiate that distinction with the authorities. He looked around the room. Gerald Bredall was a man who paid attention to numbers, he said. He found a pattern in a set of financial documents that most people would have glossed over, and he followed it with the persistence of a man who believed that truth, once found, carries an obligation. He was right about what he found. He was wrong about one thing only, that the people involved would permit him the time to act on it. A pause. He died for paying attention. The least we owe him is the same. He looked at me. I went to the kitchen door and knocked twice. The aftermath, as it always is, was both neater and messier than the theory. Philip Osterbrook was charged with second-degree manslaughter and entered a guilty plea in exchange for full cooperation regarding the corruption scheme. Marcus Webb earned his fee. Felix Caro was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, which is a harder thing to prove than the simple version. But the combination of Diana Creel's testimony, Osterbrook's cooperation, and the prepaid phone evidence made the DA's office reasonably confident. The federal corruption charges were filed separately and are still working their way through the system. Warren Hood resigned from the foundation and cooperated extensively. Sylvia Donat took over as interim director and immediately hired a forensic accountant, which she should have done 2 years ago but hadn't, which is the thing about looking at uncomfortable numbers. You only do it when you're more afraid of not knowing than knowing. The Meridian Cultural Foundation, stripped of its bad actors and most of its recent endowment, is smaller now, but apparently cleaner, which is the best you can say about most things after a scandal runs through them. Diana Creel talked to the DA and walked away with immunity and the residue of a bad decision she'd have to carry for a while. Constance Bredall paid our fee and wrote Wolfe a letter, which he read once, set on his desk, and didn't discuss. I read it while he was upstairs with the orchids. It was 3 sentences. You gave my brother's death its correct name. You cannot know what that means. Wolfe, if he had a response to this, kept it to himself, which is probably the correct response to a sentence like that. On the Friday after the case was closed, I was in the office doing paperwork when Wolfe came down from the plant rooms at 11 and settled into his chair and opened his book and sat in the comfortable silence that follows the conclusion of things. After a while I said, Caro was the smartest one in it. Yes, Wolfe said, without looking up. And he still ended up in a room, listening to you take it apart. Intelligence, Wolfe said, turning a page, is frequently the enemy of judgment. A man of ordinary intelligence makes small crimes. A man of great intelligence makes elaborate ones, and the elaboration is always, in the end, the thing that betrays him. He turned another page. Caro built a machine to kill Gerald Bredall and escape the consequence. He built it well. He neglected to account for the possibility that someone would look at the machine and understand what it was for. That's what we do. That, Wolfe said, with the satisfaction of a man describing a vocation rather than a job, is precisely what we do. Outside, West 35th Street was doing what it does, moving, sounding, going about the business of a city that doesn't stop for anyone's grief, or guilt, or very good detective work. The orchids were blooming upstairs. Fritz was beginning something in the kitchen that involved a great deal of butter and what I was confident, from the smell, was a very good hour at 6 o'clock. I went back to my paperwork. Gerald Brettle had looked at numbers until they told him the truth, and the truth had cost him everything. The least I could do, I figured, was finish the paperwork correctly. Some obligations are like that. Small, specific, and worth keeping.